May it please the court.
Yes, ma'am.
Actions speak louder than words. Growing up, I was always told that while words may lie, actions always tell the truth. Now today you heard the words of multiple people, and we asked you to listen closely and focus on what words may be lies. But more importantly, we wanted you to focus on the actions of the defendant, because it's his actions that will tell you the truth about what happened on June 14th, 2014. He had a hammer in his hand as he was chasing his injured girlfriend who was covered in blood. And then he hid from the police. Members of the jury, these are the actions of a guilty man. It's because of these actions that he is sitting on trial today. These actions tell you about the truth of what happened on June 14th, 2014. You see, on that day, he was at home with his live-in girlfriend, Adriana Testa, when he wanted to fix up the house and hang up his favorite painting of the Velvet Elvis. You saw that painting today. When you look closely at this, you see just how large this painting is. It spreads over the size of a fireplace. But Adriana tried to help him, tried to lift this painting up. But you heard that when she just lightly dropped that painting, that was enough to make the defendant snap. He reached down into his toolbox and he pulled out a hammer. Today you saw that. This is the hammer that he reached out and grabbed. And he took it and he hit Adriana in the skull, causing wounds to her head and blood to rush down her back. She was scared, confused, didn't know what to do. She ran outside screaming for someone, anyone, to help her. But what were the actions of the defendant? He took this hammer and chased her down the street, hammer in hand. As they turned onto Royal Drive, she started trying to weave in and out of these trailers. And that's when the defendant caught back up with her. He took that hammer again and hit her, causing her to fall to the ground, causing scrapes on her hands, knees, and feet. And his next action? He left her there, bleeding in the street. He went back to his trailer and hid until police arrived. Members of the jury, these are the defendant's actions. Now, luckily, a neighbor heard Adriana's cries for help. She was transported to the hospital, where she was seen for 2 hammer-shaped wounds to her skull. And it was there that a doctor said that her injuries were consistent in size and shape with a household hammer. And he told you today that they were consistent with this hammer. You heard about the actions of the defendant. And today he is on trial for first-degree assault and criminal domestic violence. Now, we, the state, we hold the burden of proving our case today, beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, to prove assault, that means that we must prove to you that the defendant acted with the intent to cause serious bodily injury, that he did cause that bodily injury, that he did so through use of a deadly weapon. And this becomes criminal domestic violence if we can prove that he committed this assault against someone with whom he was in an intimate relationship with. Now, members of the jury, we proved all of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Today we proved to you that he acted with the intent to cause serious bodily injury when we showed you his actions of having this hammer in his hand, of chasing Adriana through the street with that hammer. His intent was clear. It was to cause serious injury to Adriana. We proved the first element. The second element of serious bodily injury, we also proved that to you today. It's hard to deny that after being beaten in the skull with a hammer, that those injuries are not serious. And a doctor came to the stand today and explained to you all of the risks associated with that injury. It really doesn't matter if there was a fracture or a concussion. The fact is that this was a life-threatening injury. We proved our second element. Now, as to the final element of a deadly weapon, the judge is going to explain to you exactly what that means after I'm done speaking with you today. And once he explains the law to you, you will see that using a hammer to blow bludgeon someone in the skull, that is using a deadly weapon. So today we proved assault. And this is also domestic violence because he committed this assault against Adriana Testa, his live-in girlfriend, which no one can dispute they were in an intimate relationship. Today we proved all of our elements, beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, when you go into deliberation, you're going to be thinking about exactly what a reasonable doubt means and what beyond a reasonable doubt means. But it's just as important to focus on what it does not mean. Because beyond a reasonable doubt is not beyond all doubt. It's not beyond a shadow of a doubt. You see, a reasonable doubt is not a possible, imaginary, forced, speculative, or fanciful doubt. This doubt must be founded in reason. Members of the jury, there is only one reasonable explanation for the defendant's actions that night, and that is his guilt. We proved our case through two witnesses. First, we called Adriana Testa to the stand. She had to relive those horrific moments of June 14, 2014. Now, the defense wants you to think that she's not trustworthy, that she changed her story and made this whole thing up. And they tried to do that only through one witness, the eyewitness Jordan Kravitz. Now, when Ms. Testa took the stand today, she told you that he's known around town as the Crazy Lou. And on cross-examination, we asked him about this statement he claims that Adriana made to him. And what you learned was that that statement was that she received her injuries from falling on Canny Bayou Lane. The same road that that eyewitness saw her on the entire time. The same road that he never saw her fall on. That just doesn't add up. Remember that this is the defendant's good friend. Keep in mind that words may lie, but actions always tell the truth. Adriana Testa told you about the defendant's actions that night. She told you how he took out this hammer and he hit her in the skull. He chased her down the street with that hammer, hitting her again and causing her to fall. And then he left her in the street bleeding. Those are the actions of a guilty man. The next witness we called was Dr. Derek Shepard. You heard how he saw her injuries. He saw how severe they were, and he saw that they were consistent with this hammer. These two witnesses proved to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. Now, after we presented our case, the defense had an opportunity to call their own witnesses. And during their case, we asked you to keep in mind just two questions. What actions were they unable to deny? And what do these actions tell you about the defendant's guilt? The first action, having this hammer in his hand. Now, they tried to explain that he was using this hammer to hang a picture on the wall. But you saw the hangers he was using. Members of the jury, look at this and you will see that there are absolutely no nails, even though this was all the hardware he had. This is what the police took from his home. There are only screws. But today you learned that it wasn't a screwdriver that the defendant had in his hand as he was chasing Adriana through the street. It was this hammer. The next action they couldn't deny was that he was chasing her with that hammer through the street. Now, they tried to say that he was just trying to help her, trying to protect her, but he never once called the police. He never stopped and asked anyone for help. He just kept chasing her with this hammer in his hand while she had hammer-shaped wounds to her skull. And then his final action was hiding until the police arrived, while his girlfriend lay bloody in the street. These are the actions of a guilty man. Members of the jury, actions speak louder than words. He had a hammer in his hand as he was chasing his injured girlfriend, and then he hid from the police. We ask that you do the only thing that the defendant's actions support. Find him guilty of both charges. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bryson. Ms. Pliskin?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. report, Your Honor.
Yes, ma'am.
The prosecution just came before you with a case built on nothing but he said, she said. Peter Seeger is on trial here today for first-degree assault and criminal domestic violence. And in accusing him of those crimes, the prosecution has the burden of proving to you that he is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But in the case you just heard, there's conflicting medical evidence and conflicting testimony. And he said, she said, is not enough to convict Peter Seeger. My name is Alexa Kleska, and at the beginning of today's trial, my co-counsel, Mrs. McMenamin, asked you to keep 3 questions in mind. She asked you, what evidence can be trusted? What testimony can be trusted? And what motives do the parties in this case have? Keep those questions in mind as we walk through the evidence and discover the answers. Today's case surrounds the events of June 14th, 2014. Now, you heard from both Ms. Testa and the defendant, Mr. Seeger, today, but their stories are conflicting. Ms. Testa told you that Peter Seeger hit her in the head with a hammer following a dispute over the Velvet Elvis painting. But then you heard from Mr. Seeger, and he clarified what really happened that night. He told you that June 14th began like any other night, with Ms. Testa getting ready for work by taking her Xanax and washing it down with a Red Bull vodka. He stated that he got his Velvet Elvis painting out of storage. Why? To make their house feel more like a home. That was his most prized possession. And when he tried to hang it on the wall, Ms. Testa went nuts. He testified that she screamed at him, she spit on him, and she told him that if he hung that painting, she would leave the trailer, pretend that he had been hitting her, and call the police. Well, Mr. Seeger didn't know what was going on. He thought she was just being ridiculous and that it was the alcohol talking. So he continued to hang the painting. But when he did, Ms. Testa bolted out the front door of the trailer. She ran around the trailer park, weaving, falling all over the place. She hit her knees, her hands, and her head. This story is corroborated by the only eyewitness to today's trial, Miss Kravitz. And she got up on the stand today and told you that she knew the defendant and she knew Adriana Testa very well. But she knew there was a dark side to the relationship because she knew that Adriana Testa liked her Red Bulls with a lot of vodka. Now, the prosecution tried to bring Mrs. Kravitz's testimony into question today. But if you remember, it was Adriana Testa that told Mrs. Kravitz that she fell on Caney Bayou. So it's not Miss Kravitz that can't keep her story straight, it's Miss Testa. And we already knew that. We already knew that she can't keep her story straight because she changed her story. But what did the defendant do? When the police arrived that night, he cooperated from the start. He talked to them, he explained what had happened, and he waived his right to silence in this courtroom today because he wanted to explain what happened. You also heard from Dr. Shepard today. Dr. Shepard is the medical professional who saw Adriana Testa on the night of June 14th. But as you heard, there's absolutely no medical evidence to back up Dr. Shepard's words. There's no x-ray that said that Adriana Testa had a skull fracture, a concussion, or even a bruise. There's no CT scan that says Adriana Testa was suffering from a skull fracture, concussion, again, even a bruise. In fact, there is a CT scan that says the exact opposite. Because on June 15th, the day following the incident, Adriana Testa got a CT scan. And that CT scan was that she was completely normal, less than 24 hours after the incident. Now, members of the jury, as we both know that sometimes he said, she said, is the only evidence that exists in cases. And sometimes that's enough for the prosecution to reach their burden of beyond a reasonable doubt. But in this case, when there's evidence, medical evidence, and eyewitness evidence that go against and are contrary contrary to the she said story, then it becomes a story of reasonable doubt. This is the evidence that was shown to you by the state today. They showed you these screws and these hooks. But Mr. Seeger got up on the stand today and told you that all he was doing was using these hooks to put on the back of the painting so he could hang it up using a hammer. Now, how does this evidence prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Peter Seeger is guilty of hitting Miss Testa in the head with a hammer? It doesn't. The prosecution also showed you this hammer, the alleged weapon from that night. The prosecution got up before you today and they painted you a bloody picture. They told you time and time again that Miss Testa was covered in blood, that she had blood on her hands, on her knees, on her feet, on her head. But look at this alleged weapon. There's not a spot of blood on this hammer. This does not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Peter Seeger is guilty. Members of the jury, at the end of the day, that CT scan is the only objective medical piece of evidence in this entire case. It is the only evidence that was presented to you by somebody who doesn't have a dog in this fight. The person who did that CT scan isn't here today. Dr. Shepard was here today. Miss Testa was here today. And that CT scan tells you that she was completely normal. How is that possible? It doesn't add up. Now, members of the jury, the prosecution has the burden of proving their case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. We, the defense, we don't have any burden. Mr. Seeger could have sat back at that table, he could have kicked up his legs and not said a word, but he did. He got up on that stand today and explained to you what happened. If you look closely at the prosecution's case, you will see that it is full of conflicting evidence. And you will see that it doesn't add up. Because the prosecution tried to sell you a story today. They tried to sell you a story that Peter Seeger was so mad when Adriana Testa dropped his painting that he picked up a hammer and he hit her in the head with it. But if you look closely at all the conflicting evidence in this case, you will see that it is just that, a story. They want you to believe that that story is more reasonable than Miss Testa, the woman who was drunk and on Xanax that night, made up this elaborate lie and fell in the street, causing her injuries. A lie that would enable her to keep living in her boyfriend's trailer for free when he was out of the picture. As I already stated, the prosecution has the burden of proving this case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. We, the defense, don't have any burden. All we have to show you is that there are reasonable alternatives to what could have happened that night. Members of the jury, the prosecution told you that today's case is about actions, and that actions speak louder than words. And we may be on opposing sides in today's trial, but I agree with that statement. Actions do speak louder than words. So let's look at some of the actions of the people who you heard from today. Well, Dr. Shepard's actions? What action? He didn't even take the action to run an x-ray on his patient. He didn't even take the action to run a CT scan on his patient that would enable him to come to a medical conclusion, and not an opinion, a conclusion of what she was suffering from that night. But he didn't take that action. What about Miss Testa's actions? Her actions caused her to tip Papa Xanax, drink some Red Bull vodka, and then run out into the street. She couldn't even take the action to put what actually happened that night in her victim impact statement. Do you remember that she didn't even put in her statement that Mr. Seeger hit her in the head after they had left the trailer? She couldn't even take the action to put a very important piece of evidence in her statement. Members of the jury, actions do speak louder than words. But Mr. Seeger's actions caused him to get up on the stand today and explain to you what really happened. The prosecution's case is built on nothing but he said, she said, and they cannot meet their burden of reasonable doubt. And that is why we, the defense, are asking you to find Peter Seeger not guilty of first-degree assault and criminal domestic violence. Thank you.
Counsel?
May it please the court,
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, members of the jury. Actions speak louder than words. But opposing counsel came before you and wanted you to think that this case is just about what he said or she said. But they ignored what one of their own witnesses said, who they claim is the only objective witness, Jordan Kravitz. When she took the stand today, she told you that she saw Adriana Testo run out of her trailer onto Canny Bayou. She never saw her fall, but what she did see was that she was covered in blood, that blood was running down her neck. That means only one thing, that she couldn't get those injuries from falling because she was already bleeding when she left the apartment that night. But members of the jury, you don't just have to listen to what she said. You can listen to what everyone said in court today, the undisputed actions of the defendant. That he had this hammer in his hand, that he was chasing Adriana through the street with this hammer still in hand, and then he ran and hid from the police, still with that hammer. Members of the jury, these actions only support one verdict, and that verdict